The morning air in Frankfurt carried the smell of coal, smoke, and anxiety. It was September 11th, 1944, and Helga Schneider descended the concrete steps into the bunker for what felt like the 100th time that summer. At 19 years old, she wore the field grey uniform of a Luftnachrichtenhelferin, a signals communications auxiliary of the Luftwaffe, with the lightning bolt insignia stitched neatly on her sleeve. Her hands moved with practiced efficiency as she took her position at the telephone switchboard, plugging cables into their sockets, routing calls between fighter control stations and anti-aircraft batteries across the Frankfurt defense sector. The air raid siren's wail had become almost routine. 3, 4, sometimes 5 times a week, the American bombers came. And 3, 4, sometimes 5 times a week, Helga listened through her headset as Luftwaffe fighter pilots scrambled to intercept them, their voices crackling with confidence and aggression as they climbed to meet the enemy formations. She believed absolutely, completely believed that German fighters would win. It wasn't blind faith. It was mathematics. It was engineering. It was everything she'd been taught since joining the Luftwaffe Auxiliary Corps 2 years earlier. The Messerschmitt Bf-109 was faster and more maneuverable than anything the Americans flew. The Focke-Wulf 190 could outclimb a B-17 and carried cannons that could tear through aluminum like paper. Every briefing, every training session, every piece of propaganda she'd consumed had reinforced the same message. German fighters were superior, American bombers were lumbering targets. The air war, despite the bombs that fell on Frankfurt streets, was being won. Helga had no reason to doubt it. After all, she heard the victory reports herself, pilots calling in their kills, ground controllers tallying the numbers, intelligence officers compiling the statistics that showed dozens, sometimes hundreds of American bombers shot down each month. Yes, bombs still fell. Yes, the raids continued, but that was temporary. A matter of attrition. Eventually, the Americans would run out of airplanes, or pilots, or will. They would stop coming. Or so she believed. Until that September afternoon, when everything she thought she knew about the air war shattered like glass under a hammer blow. If you're enjoying this deep dive into the story, hit the subscribe button and let us know in the comments from where in the world you are watching from today. To understand what happened to Helga Schneider, we need to understand who she was and what she represented. She was not a Nazi ideologue. She was not a volunteer driven by fanatical belief in Adolf Hitler's vision of a 1,000-year Reich. She was a working-class girl from Frankfurt who, in 1942, received a conscription notice that gave her no choice in the matter. By February of 1941, the Luftwaffe had established the Luftnachrichtenhelferinnen, the Corps of Women Signals Auxiliaries. It was a desperate measure disguised as an organizational innovation. Germany was running out of men. The Eastern Front was consuming soldiers at a rate that defied comprehension. The North African campaign demanded more troops. The occupation of France, the Balkans, Norway, all of it required manpower that Germany simply did not have. So they turned to women. Initially, the recruitment was voluntary. Posters appeared in cities across the Reich, showing young women in smart uniforms, serving the fatherland with dignity and purpose. The propaganda emphasized femininity. These were not soldiers, the posters insisted, but helpers. Auxiliaries. They would perform clerical work, operate telephone switchboards, assist with communications. They would remain feminine, modest, supportive. They would free German men to fight. But by 1942, voluntary recruitment was not sufficient. The Wehrmacht issued orders allowing the conscription of unmarried women between the ages of 18 and 40 into auxiliary service. It was mandatory. It was unavoidable. And for girls like Helga Schneider, it meant leaving home, putting on a uniform, and entering a military structure that, officially, did not consider them members of the armed forces. This was a crucial distinction. Women in the Wehrmacht auxiliary services were not soldiers. They received no military rank in the traditional sense. They were paid according to civil service scales, not military pay grades. They could not carry weapons, could not engage in combat, could not officially be considered combatants under the laws of war. And yet they wore uniforms, lived under military discipline, worked in military installations, and found themselves, increasingly, on the front lines of a war that made no distinction between combatant and non-combatant when the bombs began to fall. By November of 1944, more than 500,000 women served in the Wehrmacht auxiliary forces. Half were volunteers, half were not. Helga was among the latter. She was trained at a facility outside Frankfurt for 6 weeks in the autumn of 1942. The training was basic but thorough: operation of military telephone switchboards, radio communication protocols, cipher procedures, air raid response. She learned the organizational structure of the Luftwaffe's home defense network, the call signs of fighter squadrons, the standard phrases used in combat reports. She learned to remain calm under pressure, to route communications efficiently even when the building shook from nearby explosions, to never question or delay an order from a superior officer. And she learned, through constant repetition, that German air power was supreme. This was not presented as propaganda, though of course it was. It was presented as fact. The instructors were Luftwaffe officers, men who had flown missions over Poland, France, and England. They spoke with authority about the technical specifications of German fighters, the inadequacies of Allied bombers, the inevitable trajectory of the air war. The Messerschmitt Bf 109, they explained, had a top speed of 390 miles per hour. The American B-17 Flying Fortress could manage only 287 miles per hour at maximum velocity. The Focke-Wulf 190 could climb to 37,000 feet. The B-17's service ceiling was 35,000. The numbers told a clear story. German fighters were faster, could climb higher, were more agile. They would intercept the bombers, attack them before they reached their targets, and shoot them down in numbers that would eventually break the American will to continue the daylight bombing campaign. Helga absorbed this information as truth. Why wouldn't she? It came from officers. It came from men who had fought. It was supported by technical data. And most importantly, it aligned with what she wanted to believe, that Germany, despite the setbacks on the Eastern Front, despite the Allied landings in North Africa, despite the constant bombing raids, was still winning the war that mattered most, the war in the skies over the Reich. By the summer of 1944, Helga had been stationed at a Luftwaffe communications post on the outskirts of Frankfurt for nearly 2 years. Her days followed a predictable rhythm: morning shift at the switchboard, afternoon briefings, evening duty if bombers were expected. She lived in a barracks with 11 other Luftnachrichtenhelferinnen, girls from all over Germany, some as young as 17, others in their mid-20s. They shared cigarettes when they could get them, wrote letters home, complained about the food, and tried not to think too much about the fact that Frankfurt was being slowly destroyed around them. The bombing raids had intensified dramatically in 1944. The U.S. 8th Air Force, based in England, was mounting missions of staggering scale. On February 20th, over 1,000 B-17s and B-24s hit targets across Germany in what became known as Big Week, a coordinated offensive designed to destroy the German aircraft industry. The raids continued through spring and summer. Oil refineries, ball-bearing factories, rail yards. Anything that kept the German war machine running was now a target. And yet, from Helga's perspective inside the communications network, the Luftwaffe seemed to be holding its own. She heard the radio chatter, pilots reporting kills, bombers going down in flames, formations breaking apart under fighter attack. The numbers were impressive, sometimes 20, 30, 40 American aircraft reported shot down in a single mission. The Luftwaffe propaganda machine took these pilot reports and amplified them, releasing bulletins that claimed catastrophic Allied losses. What Helga did not know, what no one told her, was that the numbers were lies. Not complete fabrications, but systematic exaggerations. In the chaos of air combat, multiple pilots would claim credit for the same bomber. A B-17 trailing smoke would be counted as destroyed by 3 different pilots who had attacked it. Aircraft that limped back to England with battle damage were listed as confirmed kills. The fog of war, combined with the Luftwaffe's institutional need to show success, created a statistical fantasy where American losses were always higher than reality. And because Helga only knew what she heard through her headset and read in official reports, she believed the fantasy. She believed that German fighters were shooting down American bombers in devastating numbers. She believed that the continued bombing raids were a sign of American desperation, not American industrial capacity. She believed that eventually, inevitably, the Americans would have to stop because they would simply run out of aircraft. She believed right up until the moment she came face to face with an American pilot who explained, calmly and methodically, why everything she believed was wrong. The end came quickly for Helga's communications post. On September 8, 1944, American armored units broke through German defensive lines near Aachen, about 120 miles northwest of Frankfurt. The breakthrough was unexpected, rapid, and overwhelming. Wehrmacht units that had been holding the line suddenly found themselves outflanked and encircled. Supply lines collapsed. Communications networks went dark. And isolated military installations, including a small Luftwaffe communications post that had seemed safely behind the lines, suddenly found themselves in the path of advancing American tanks. Helga's commanding officer, an older Luftwaffe sergeant who had been invalided out of flight duty after a crash in North Africa, made the decision quickly. There were no orders from higher command. The telephone lines to Frankfurt had gone dead. He could hear tank engines in the distance, growing closer. He gathered the 12 Luftnachrichtenhelferinnen under his command and told them bluntly. They were surrendering. They would destroy their cipher equipment, burn their code books, and wait for the Americans to arrive. There was no fighting. The Americans arrived with overwhelming force tanks, armored personnel carriers, infantry with automatic weapons, and accepted the surrender of one exhausted sergeant and 12 terrified young women without incident. The Americans were professional, almost courteous. No one was harmed. They were given water, food rations that tasted strange but were abundant, and medical attention for one girl who had twisted her ankle running down the stairs during the initial panic. Then they were transported to a temporary holding facility, an old schoolhouse that the American military police had converted into a processing center for German prisoners of war. This was where Helga Schneider's world began to crack. The schoolhouse had been chosen for its relative intactness in a region of destroyed villages and cratered roads. It sat in a small town called Rottgen, just across the German border from Belgium, and it served as a waypoint where captured German military personnel could be documented, interrogated, and sorted before being moved to larger POW camps further west. Most prisoners stayed only a day or two before being loaded onto trucks and driven away. But on September 11, 1944, the facility was overcrowded and understaffed. The rapid American advance had netted hundreds of prisoners in a matter of days, and the processing system was overwhelmed. So Helga and her 11 companions waited. They were given a classroom on the second floor, bare except for wooden benches and a blackboard still covered with chalked arithmetic problems from before the war. An American military policeman stood guard outside the door, rifle slung casually over his shoulder, chewing gum with mechanical regularity. He brought them food twice a day, sea rations in olive-drab tins, white bread that seemed impossibly soft, coffee that tasted like oil but was hot and caffeinated. The girls sat on the benches and tried to process what had happened. Some cried. Others sat in silence. A few made dark jokes about becoming prisoners in their own country. Helga said little. She was trying to understand how the war she thought Germany was winning had suddenly placed her in an American POW facility, wearing her Luftwaffe uniform, waiting to be transported west into enemy territory. On the evening of September 11th, the door opened and 8 men were ushered into the classroom. They wore leather flight jackets, heavy boots, and the unmistakable look of exhaustion that comes from surviving something terrible. Their uniforms identified them as U.S. Army Air Forces. Several had bandages. One limped badly. All of them looked grateful simply to be alive. They were the crew of a B-17 flying fortress that had been shot down that afternoon near Leipzig, about 250 miles to the east. The American military policeman explained, in broken German, that the facility was at capacity and this was the only available space. The 8 airmen would be held here temporarily until transport could be arranged. He apologized for the inconvenience, made a joke that no one understood, and closed the door. For several minutes, no one spoke. The Americans settled themselves on the floor along one wall. The German women remained on their benches. The two groups studied each other warily, both trying to reconcile the surreal situation enemy combatants, thrown together by the chaos of war, waiting in a converted schoolroom for whatever came next. Then, slowly, carefully, one of the American airmen began to speak in halting German. His name was Lieutenant James Morrison. He was 24 years old, from somewhere in Ohio that Helga had never heard of, and he had flown 38 combat missions over Germany before his bomber took catastrophic flak damage over a synthetic oil refinery, and he gave the order for his crew to bail out. He was the pilot. The man beside him was his co-pilot. The others were his navigator, bombardier, flight engineer, radio operator, and 2 gunners. The ball turret gunner had been killed when a flak shell exploded directly beneath the aircraft. The tail gunner had been severely wounded and was currently in an American field hospital somewhere to the west. Morrison spoke slowly, choosing his words carefully, translating his thoughts into a language he had studied in college but rarely used. And because one of the German women, a clerk named Erika Braun, who had worked in her father's import business before the war, spoke decent English, a conversation began. At first, it was hostile. The American airmen were prisoners, but they were also men who had spent the past 18 months dropping bombs on German cities. The German women were prisoners too, but they were also members of an organization that had fought to shoot down those bombers and kill those men. The mutual resentment simmered beneath every word. Erika translated while the others listened. Morrison asked where the women had been stationed. Helga answered, "A communications post near Frankfurt." Morrison nodded. He had bombed Frankfurt 4 times. Helga stiffened. People had died in those raids. Friends, neighbors, people she knew. Morrison said he was sorry, but he didn't look sorry. He looked tired. He said his job was to hit military targets, factories, rail yards, oil refineries. He said he didn't enjoy it. He said he wished the war would end, but until it did, he would keep flying, keep bombing, keep doing what his government told him to do. One of the other German women, her name was Greta, and she had lost her entire family when a bomb struck their apartment building. In Hamburg, asked Morrison how he could justify killing civilians. Erika translated. Morrison's face hardened. He said the Luftwaffe had bombed London, Coventry, Warsaw, Rotterdam. He said his government believed that destroying Germany's capacity to make war would end the war faster and save more lives in the long run. He said he didn't expect Germans to agree with that logic, but it was the logic that sent him over Germany 38 times. The conversation could have ended there, dissolved into mutual recrimination and silence. But then Helga asked a question that changed everything. She asked, "How many bombers have we shot down?" Morrison looked at her for a long moment. Then he said, in his careful, accented German, "Not as many as you think." And that was when the interrogation began, not of Morrison by Helga, but of Helga by Morrison. Because Morrison realized, listening to these young women talk, that they genuinely believed Germany was winning the air war. They believed that Luftwaffe fighters were shooting down American bombers in catastrophic numbers. They believed that the continued bombing raids were a sign of desperation rather than overwhelming industrial superiority. They believed, fundamentally, that German air power was superior. And Morrison, who had watched friends die, who had flown through walls of flak that turned the sky black, who had seen Messerschmitts and Focke-Wulfs attack his formation with suicidal aggression, knew that belief was a lie. So he told them the truth. He started with a simple question. "Do you know what a B-17 is?" Helga nodded. Of course she knew. The Flying Fortress. A 4-engine heavy bomber. Slow, heavy, vulnerable to fighter attack. She'd heard dozens of Luftwaffe pilots describe attacking them, shooting them down, watching them fall in flames. Morrison smiled, but there was no humor in it. "Let me tell you about the B-17, he said. And over the next 2 hours, sitting on the floor of that converted classroom while evening turned to night outside the blacked-out windows, Lieutenant James Morrison gave Helga Schneider and her companions a technical briefing on why the aircraft they'd been told was a death trap was, in fact, one of the most survivable bombers ever built. He explained the defensive armament first. 13 Browning Mir-2 50-caliber machine guns. Not the lighter rifle-caliber weapons that some bombers carried, but heavy machine guns, each capable of firing 800 rounds per minute, each round half an inch in diameter, each capable of tearing through aircraft aluminum or killing a pilot at 1,000 yards. The guns were positioned in overlapping fields of fire. 2 in a power-operated turret under the nose, 2 in a turret on top of the fuselage behind the cockpit, 2 more in a ball turret that hung beneath the belly, 2 in manually operated positions at the waist, 2 in the tail turret. Every approach angle was covered. Any fighter that came within range faced a wall of 50-caliber fire from multiple guns simultaneously. Morrison described how B-17s flew in tight defensive formations called combat boxes, staggered arrangements of 12 to 18 aircraft, where the defensive fire from each bomber overlapped with the others, creating a zone of intersecting fire streams that made it nearly suicidal for fighters to attack head-on or from directly astern. German fighters, he explained, had learned this the hard way in 1942 and 1943. They had tried frontal attacks and lost hundreds of pilots to concentrated defensive fire. They had tried attacking from the rear and found the tail guns surprisingly lethal. They had eventually resorted to attacking from high angles or using rocket systems to stand off from the formations tactics that were less accurate but kept them out of the worst of the defensive fire. Then Morrison talked about survivability. He described the self-sealing fuel, tanks' rubber-lined bladders that would automatically seal themselves when punctured by bullets or shell fragments, preventing catastrophic fuel fires. He explained the redundant hydraulic systems that allowed a pilot to control the aircraft even after multiple hits. He talked about the armor plating around crew positions, the reinforced structure that could take damage that would tear other aircraft apart, the sheer, robust over-engineering of the B-17 that allowed it to absorb punishment and keep flying. He told them stories. The bomber that returned to England with 3 engines shot out, the aircraft that landed with more than 500 bullet holes in its fuselage, the crew that brought their B-17 home after a mid-air collision tore off half the tail. He wasn't exaggerating. Every bomber pilot knew these stories because they were true, documented, photographed. The B-17 had earned its nickname not because it bristled with guns, but because it could be shot to pieces and still bring its crew home alive. Helga listened to all of this with growing unease. Because if what Morrison was saying was true, if the B-17 was this survivable, this well-defended, this difficult to destroy, then the victory reports she'd been hearing for 2 years were. What? Exaggerations? Lies? Morrison saw the doubt in her face and pressed his advantage. "You want to know how many B-17s your fighters shot down?" he asked. "I can tell you exactly. In 1943, the 8th Air Force lost about 350 bombers to German fighters. In the first 8 months of 1944, we've lost maybe 400 more. Total. Across 2 years, about 750 aircraft." He paused, watching the women process this number. "Do you know how many bombers we sent over Germany in that same period?" He continued. "More than 200,000 sorties. 200,000 times, American bombers flew into German airspace and dropped their bombs. Your fighters shot down less than 1% of them. The number hung in the air like smoke. Less than 1%. Erica translated carefully, making sure everyone understood. Several of the women shook their heads. That couldn't be right. They had heard reports of dozens of bombers shot down in single raids. They had heard pilots claiming 5, 6, 7 kills. The numbers Morrison was citing made no sense, but Morrison wasn't finished. "I know what your pilots claim," he said. I've read the intelligence reports. Your propaganda says you're shooting down 50, 100, 200 bombers every major raid. But here's what you need to understand. In combat, everything is chaos. A pilot attacks a bomber, sees smoke pouring from an engine, and claims it destroyed. But that bomber might make it back to England. We've had aircraft come home with 2 engines out, half the tail gone, hydraulics shot to hell, and German pilots claimed them as kills. We've had multiple pilots claim credit for the same aircraft. We've had bombers listed as destroyed that were flying again 2 weeks later after repairs. He leaned forward, his voice dropping. Your kill claims are inflated by a factor of 3, maybe 4. For every bomber you actually destroy, your pilots claim 3 or 4. I don't blame them, it's an honest mistake in the heat of combat. But your intelligence services take those claims and report them as facts. Your propaganda ministry takes those facts and publishes them in newspapers. And people like you believe them because you have no reason not to. Greta spoke up, her voice sharp with anger. So you're saying our pilots are lying? No, Morrison said immediately. I'm saying they're wrong. There's a difference. Combat is confusing. When you're flying 300 miles an hour, pulling 4 Gs, with flak exploding around you and enemy fire tearing through your aircraft, you don't have time to verify kills. You see a bomber smoking. You assume it's going down. You move on to the next target. That's human nature. But it doesn't make it true. He gestured to his crew, sitting silently against the wall. My aircraft took more than 200 hits today. 2 engines failed. Our hydraulics were destroyed. We were leaking fuel. Any German pilot who attacked us and then had to break off because of other threats would have reported us as destroyed, and he would have believed it. But we're not destroyed. We bailed out. We survived. 8 of us are sitting in this room, right now, alive, prisoners of war but alive. And somewhere, some Luftwaffe pilot is being credited with 10 kills because he managed to damage my aircraft and 9 others before running out of ammunition. The silence that followed was profound, because Helga was beginning to understand what Morrison was really saying. It wasn't just that the kill numbers were wrong, it was that the entire framework she'd used to understand the air war was built on false data. Every report she'd filed, every briefing she'd attended, every conversation she'd had with other Luftnachrichtenhelferinnen had been based on the assumption that German fighters were winning the war of attrition against American bombers. But if Morrison was right, if the actual loss rate was less than 1% instead of the 20, 30, 40% that propaganda claimed, then Germany wasn't winning anything. The bombers were getting through. They were hitting their targets. And they were doing it at a sustainable loss rate that meant they could keep coming, day after day, week after week, month after month, until there was nothing left of Germany's industrial capacity. Morrison saw the realization dawning on her face and delivered the final blow. Do you want to know the real reason you're losing the air war? He asked quietly. It's not because your fighters aren't good enough. The 109 is a fine aircraft. The 190 is better than fine. It's probably the best piston engine fighter Germany ever built. Your pilots are brave, skilled, aggressive. On a technical level, you could argue your aircraft are equal to or better than ours in certain categories. He paused. But there's one thing you can't compete with, and it's the thing that's going to destroy you. American industrial production. He looked around the room, making eye contact with each woman in turn. In 1944, Boeing, Douglas, and Lockheed are producing about 300 B-17s per month. 300. That's 10 bombers per day, every single day. By the time this war ends, we'll have built more than 12,000 B-17s. 12,000. And that's just one type of bomber. We're also building B-24s at an even faster rate. Consolidated's Willow Run plant in Michigan is producing 1 B-24 every hour. Every single hour of every single day. He let that number sink in. So yes, your fighters shoot down our bombers. But, for every one you destroy, we build 10 more. You shoot down 100 of our bombers in a month, and we replace them in 3 days. You kill our pilots, and we have 50,000 more in training back in the States. You damage our aircraft industry, and we have factories in Detroit, Seattle, San Diego, Fort Worth, all working 3 shifts, 24 hours a day, producing aircraft faster than you can shoot them down. Morrison's voice grew harder, more urgent. That's why you're losing. Not because your technology is inferior, not because your pilots aren't brave enough, but because you're fighting arithmetic, and arithmetic doesn't care about courage or ideology. You're in an attritional war against an opponent who can replace losses 10 times faster than you can, and there's no possible way you can win that kind of war. Another long silence. Then, finally, Helga asked the question that had been building in her mind since Morrison started talking. If what you're saying is true, she said slowly, why do the bombers keep coming? If our fighters aren't shooting you down, if your losses are so low, why don't you just stop? Why keep bombing German cities if you've already won? Morrison looked at her with something that might have been respect. Because we haven't won, he said simply. Not yet. As long as Germany can produce aircraft, tanks, ammunition, fuel, as long as your factories are running and your armies are fighting, the war continues. Our job is to destroy those factories, to cut your supply lines, to make it impossible for you to keep fighting. And we'll keep doing that job every single day until your government surrenders or until there's nothing left to bomb. He leaned back against the wall, exhausted. I don't enjoy it, he added quietly. I don't enjoy knowing that bombs I dropped killed people who probably had nothing to do with starting this war. But I also know that if we don't destroy your capacity to make war, this war will go on for years, and millions more people will die, including probably me and everyone else in this room. So we bomb, and you fight back, and people die on both sides, and it's all terrible and stupid and tragic. But that's war. And it won't stop until one side or the other can't fight anymore. The conversation continued for another hour, though with less intensity. Morrison and his crew described their life on an airbase in England, the early morning wake-ups, the pre-flight briefings, the gut-churning anxiety of climbing into a bomber knowing you might not come back, the strange mixture of boredom and terror that defined combat flying. The German women talked about their work in the communications network, the bombing raids they'd endured, the friends and family members they'd lost. Slowly, grudgingly, a kind of mutual understanding emerged. Not friendship, the gulf was too wide for that, and the wounds too fresh, but a recognition that the people on both sides of the war were, in most ways, just ordinary humans caught up in machinery far larger than themselves. But for Helga Schneider, something fundamental had broken. She had spent 2 years believing in German air superiority. She had believed that the Luftwaffe was shooting down American bombers in devastating numbers. She had believed that the continued bombing raids were a sign of desperation, of an enemy throwing aircraft and lives away in a futile attempt to break German morale. She had believed that eventually, inevitably, the Americans would have to stop because they would run out of planes. And in the span of a single evening, sitting in a converted schoolroom with an American pilot who spoke broken German and explained basic mathematics, all of those beliefs had collapsed. The numbers were undeniable. If Morrison was telling the truth, and Helga had no reason to think he was lying, because lying would serve no purpose, then German fighter kill claims were inflated by a factor of at least 3 to 1. Which meant that when Luftwaffe intelligence reported 90 bombers shot down in a major raid, the real number was probably 30. When pilots claimed 5 or 6 kills, they had probably destroyed 1 or 2. The entire statistical framework that supported German confidence in the air war was built on systematically exaggerated data, and the production numbers were even more devastating. Helga knew, because everyone in Germany knew, that American industrial capacity was enormous. But she hadn't understood what that meant in practical terms. 300 B-17s per month, 10 per day, 12,000 total over the course of the war. Those weren't just statistics, they represented an industrial base so vast, so productive, that Germany simply could not compete. Germany's entire aircraft industry, even at its peak in 1944, was producing about 4,000 fighters per month. That sounded impressive until you realized that the Americans were producing nearly twice that number, just in bombers, not counting fighters. And the American factories were doing it with better efficiency, better logistics, better access to raw materials, and none of the disruption caused by Allied bombing raids. It was, as Morrison had said, arithmetic. And arithmetic was pitiless. Helga sat on her bench long after the conversation had died down, staring at nothing, trying to process what she'd learned. If German fighters couldn't stop the bombers, and clearly they couldn't, because the raids kept coming with metronomic regularity, then what hope was there? If American industry could replace losses faster than Germany could inflict them, then the war of attrition was already lost. If everything she'd been told about German air superiority was a lie, then what else was a lie? The invasion of the Soviet Union, had that really been the brilliant strategic masterstroke that propaganda claimed? Or was it another catastrophic miscalculation? The Atlantic wall, was it really an impenetrable fortress, or just more propaganda covering up the reality that Germany was outnumbered, outproduced, and slowly being crushed between two industrial superpowers who could afford to lose 100 battles and still win the war? For the first time in 2 years, Helga allowed herself to think the unthinkable. Germany was going to lose this war. Not might lose. Not could lose, if things went badly. Was going to lose. The outcome was inevitable, baked into the mathematics of industrial production and attrition warfare. Germany was fighting enemies who could afford to trade losses at 10-1 and still come out ahead. And no amount of courage, technical superiority, or ideological fervor could overcome that fundamental arithmetic reality. The realization was psychologically devastating, because if the war was already lost, then what was the point? What had the last 2 years of her life meant? What was the purpose of routing communications, filing, reports, coordinating fighter responses if none of it mattered? If the end was inevitable, then every day the war continued was just adding to a death toll that would make no difference to the final outcome. One of the other women, a girl named Marguerite, who couldn't have been more than 17, started crying quietly. Another woman, older, put an arm around her shoulders and murmured something soothing. But Helga noticed that the older woman's face was blank, shocked, as if she too had just watched her understanding of the world collapse and was still trying to piece together what came next. Morrison noticed the effect his words had created. He looked uncomfortable, maybe even a little guilty. "I'm sorry," he said quietly in German. "I didn't mean to. I'm not trying to break your morale or anything. You asked questions, and I answered honestly. But for what it's worth, this war won't last forever. We're winning, but we're not going to punish the German people after it's over. We're not monsters. We just want the fighting to stop." Helga looked at him and almost laughed. Not from humor, but from the sheer absurdity of the situation. Here she was, a prisoner in an American holding facility, being comforted by an enemy pilot who had just systematically destroyed every assumption she'd built her understanding of the war on, and he was apologizing for telling her the truth. "Thank you," she said, and meant it. "For being honest." Morrison nodded. Then he and his crew settled down to sleep, using their leather jackets as pillows on the hard wooden floor. Helga didn't sleep. She sat on her bench, staring at the blackboard with its faded arithmetic problems, and thought about numbers, production rates, loss ratios, sortie counts, the cold mathematics of industrial warfare. And she understood, finally, that Germany had lost this war before it even began, not on the battlefield, but in the factories. Not through lack of courage, but through lack of capacity. Germany had started a fight with opponents who could absorb catastrophic losses and still have reserves to spare, and there was no tactical brilliance or strategic genius that could overcome that fundamental disparity. The Americans came for them 3 days later. Trucks arrived, and German prisoners were sorted military personnel in one group, civilians in another, men separated from women. Helga and her companions were loaded onto a truck with several dozen other female auxiliaries who had been captured in the American advance. They were driven west, through destroyed villages and bombed-out cities, past endless columns of American troops and vehicles moving east until they reached a larger POW camp in Belgium. The camp was enormous, sprawling, filled with thousands of German prisoners. Most were Wehrmacht soldiers, but there were also Luftwaffe ground crew, SS personnel, administrative staff, auxiliaries like herself. They lived in tents, ate American rations, and waited for the war to end. Helga was there for 8 months. She was released in May of 1945, 2 weeks after Germany's unconditional surrender, and given travel documents that allowed her to return to what was left of Frankfurt. The city she came home to barely existed. Entire neighborhoods had been reduced to rubble. The train station was a skeleton of twisted metal. The streets were filled with refugees, displaced persons, former soldiers trying to find their families. The infrastructure had collapsed. Food was scarce. Winter was coming, and there was no coal for heating. But Helga was alive. And that, she reflected, was more than many could say. If you find this story engaging, please take a moment to subscribe and enable notifications. It helps us continue producing in-depth content like this. In 1947, Helga Schneider was interviewed by American military historians who were compiling oral histories of the war. The interview was conducted in German, transcribed, and filed in the U.S. Army Center of Military History. It would sit there, largely unread, for decades. In that interview, Helga described her experience in the autumn of 1944. She talked about her work as a Luftnachrichtenhelferin, about the day she was captured, about the American pilot who explained the B-17 to her. And she said something remarkable. I think I stopped believing in the war the moment that American pilot explained his airplane to me. Not because I loved America, not because I hated Germany, but because I realized we had been fighting against arithmetic. You cannot defeat arithmetic with courage. You cannot argue with production numbers. And once I understood that, everything else, all the propaganda, all the speeches about final victory, all the promises that our fighters would sweep the Americans from the sky, it all became transparent. I could see through it. And once you see through propaganda, you cannot unsee it. She paused in the interview, then continued. People ask me if I felt betrayed, if I was angry that we had been lied to. And the truth is, I don't think we were lied to in the way you might expect. I think the officers who trained us believed what they were teaching. I think the pilots who claimed those kills believed they had shot down those bombers. I think everyone in the system believed the statistics they were given, because those statistics told them what they wanted to hear. It wasn't a conspiracy. It was mass self-deception. We wanted to believe we were winning, so we built a system that told us we were winning, even when the evidence was overwhelming that we were not. Another pause. The American pilot Morrison. His name was, he didn't convince me with rhetoric or ideology. He convinced me with mathematics. 300 bombers per month, 12,000 total. Less than 1% losses. Those numbers didn't care about my feelings or my patriotism. They were just true. Were true. I understood the war was lost. Not next month or next year, but immediately. It was already over. We just hadn't admitted it yet. The interviewer asked her what she did after returning to Frankfurt in 1945. I worked, Helga said simply. There was rubble to clear, buildings to rebuild, a city to reconstruct. I married an American soldier in 1949, not Morrison. I never saw him again, but another man, a good man who had fought in the infantry and was part of the occupation forces. We moved to America in 1950. I became a citizen in 1955. My children are American. My grandchildren are American. She smiled, though the interviewer couldn't see it on the audio recording. People sometimes ask me if I regret leaving Germany, and I tell them no, I don't regret it. Because Germany taught me that you cannot build a future on lies, you cannot sustain a nation on propaganda and self-deception. Eventually, reality comes knocking, and when it does, everything built on false assumptions collapses. I would rather live in a country that tells difficult truths than one that tells comfortable lies. The interview concluded shortly after that. Helga Schneider died in Denver, Colorado, in 1996, at the age of 71. Her obituary mentioned that she had served in the German Luftwaffe auxiliaries during World War II, that she had married an American soldier, and that she had worked for 30 years as a translator for the U.S. State Department. It did not mention the conversation in a converted schoolroom in September 1944 that changed her understanding of everything she thought she knew. But that conversation, that collision between belief and evidence, between propaganda and mathematics, represents something important about the nature of the Second World War. We remember the battles: Stalingrad, Normandy, the Battle of the Bulge, the drive to Berlin. We remember the grand strategies and the famous generals. We remember the Holocaust and the atomic bombs and the Marshall Plan. But we often forget the smaller, quieter moments when individuals confronted the gap between what they believed and what was true. When the illusions that sustained them, illusions of invincibility, of superiority, of inevitable victory, collided with undeniable reality. For Helga Schneider, that moment came when an American pilot explained, in broken German, why the B-17 Flying Fortress was not the death trap that German propaganda claimed, why German kill claims were systematically inflated, why American industrial production made the outcome of the air war mathematically inevitable. The B-17 itself is worth understanding in this context. It was not, by objective standards, the best bomber of World War II. The British Lancaster could carry more bombs. The B-24 had longer range. The B-29, which would appear near the end of the war, was technologically superior in almost every way. But the B-17 had something that mattered more than raw performance. It could be produced in enormous quantities. It could absorb catastrophic damage and still fly, and it could defend itself well enough to make attacking it a costly proposition for enemy fighters. In other words, it was optimized for the kind of war America was fighting, a war of industrial attrition, where the goal was not perfection, but survivability, not individual excellence, but cumulative effect. The Germans, by contrast, had optimized for a different kind of war. Their fighters, the Bf-109, the Tu-190, the late-war jet fighters like the Me-262 were technologically sophisticated, high-performance aircraft designed to win individual engagements. And they did win those engagements, frequently. German pilots were highly trained, aggressive, tactically skilled. On a one-to-one basis, a German fighter pilot in a good aircraft had excellent odds against an American bomber crew. But the war wasn't being fought on a one-to-one basis. It was being fought on a scale where the side that could replace losses fastest would win, regardless of individual tactical outcomes. And in that kind of war, the Germans were doomed from the start. By September 1944, the month Helga Schneider was captured, the 8th Air Force was mounting raids of more than 1,000 bombers at a time. 1,000 B-17s and B-24s, flying in massive formations, escorted by hundreds of P-51 Mustang fighters that could now accompany them all the way to targets deep inside Germany. The Luftwaffe still fought back. German pilots still shot down American bombers, but the exchange rate had become unsustainable. For every American bomber destroyed, Germany was losing 2 or 3 fighters. For every American pilot killed, Germany was losing irreplaceable veterans whose training and experience could not be quickly replaced. The Luftwaffe was being ground down by attrition, and by late 1944, there was nothing they could do to stop it. Some German officers understood this. Adolf Galland, the general of the fighter arm, wrote in his reports that the Luftwaffe was losing the qualitative edge and could not sustain the attrition rates. Albert Speer, the armaments minister, understood that Allied bombing of oil production facilities had created a fuel crisis that would eventually paralyze the German military. But understanding a problem and solving it are different things, and by 1944, Germany no longer had the resources to solve the problems it faced. So the war continued. The bombers kept coming. German cities were systematically destroyed. The Luftwaffe fought on, with decreasing effectiveness, until by the spring of 1945 it barely existed as a coherent fighting force, and Germany surrendered, unconditionally, in May of that year. For Helga Schneider, sitting in that classroom in September 1944, the end of the war was still 8 months away, but psychologically it had already ended. The moment she understood that German air superiority was a myth, that the kill claims were inflated, that American production made the outcome inevitable, that was the moment the war ended for her. Everything after that was just waiting for reality to catch up with mathematics. This is the story we often forget about World War II. Not the heroic narratives of good versus evil, though those narratives have truth to them, not the grand strategy and famous battles, though those matter too, but the quiet psychological collapses that happened when propaganda met reality, when belief met evidence, when people who had been told comfortable lies were forced to confront uncomfortable truths. Helga Schneider was not unique. Across Germany in 1944 and 1945, millions of people went through similar psychological transformations. Some accepted it quickly, as Helga did. Others resisted until the very end, clinging to beliefs that became increasingly detached from reality. But eventually, reality won. It always does. The B-17 flying fortress, in this story, was more than just a weapons system. It was a physical manifestation of American industrial power. Every bomber that appeared over Germany was proof that the United States could outproduce, outsupply, and outsustain any opponent in a war of attrition. The mere fact that the bombers kept coming, day after day, month after month, despite losses, despite German resistance, despite everything the Luftwaffe could throw at them, that fact alone communicated a message more powerful than any propaganda. The message was simple. You cannot win this war, not because you lack courage, not because your technology is inferior, not because your soldiers aren't brave, but because you are fighting an opponent with 10 times your industrial capacity. And in a total war, industrial capacity is destiny. Helga Schneider understood that message in September 1944, sitting in a converted schoolroom, listening to an American pilot explain arithmetic. It took her government another 8 months to reach the same conclusion, but the conclusion was inevitable. Because sometimes, the most devastating weapon in war is not a bomb, or a bullet, or a tank. Sometimes, the most devastating weapon is simply the truth. And the truth, in this case, was that Germany had started a war it could not possibly win, against opponents it could not possibly defeat, and every day the war continued was just adding to a casualty count that would make no difference to the final outcome. That truth destroyed Helga Schneider's faith in German victory more completely than any bomb could have. And once that faith was destroyed, it could never be rebuilt. She spent the rest of her life, first in a shattered Germany, and later in America, remembering that moment when belief collided with evidence and evidence won. It's a lesson worth remembering. Propaganda can be powerful, but it cannot indefinitely survive contact with reality. Self-deception can be comforting, but arithmetic is pitiless. And in the end, wars are not won by the side that tells the best story, but by the side that can sustain the fight longest. The B-17 flying fortress, ugly and practical and brutally effective, was the physical embodiment of that principle. And for one young German woman in the autumn of 1944, it was the instrument that shattered everything she thought she knew about the war, the world, and the future. Thank you for watching. For more detailed historical breakdowns, check out the other videos on your screen now, and don't forget to subscribe.